I knew from the moment Nancy took over as HOA president that she was going to be a nightmare. The woman had a permanent scowl, a voice that could peel paint, and an ego bigger than the entire neighborhood. It didn't take long before she started throwing her weight around issuing petty fines, dictating what colors people could paint their doors, even banning certain holiday decorations because they were too gaudy. But the real problem started when she decided my driveway was her personal parking spot. It began with her SUV creeping a little too close to my property. Then, one day, I came home from work to find her car sitting smack in the middle of my driveway. Confused, I knocked on her door. "You're blocking my driveway," I said, keeping my voice calm. Nancy barely looked up from her phone. "Oh, it's just for a little while. I had a guest over and my driveway was full." I frowned. "That's not my problem. Move it." With an exaggerated sigh, she took her sweet time coming outside and getting in her car. She didn't even apologize. At first, I thought it was a one-time thing. Wishful thinking, because the next day her SUV was right there again, and the day after that. Every time I confronted her, she acted like I was the unreasonable one. "It's just for a little bit," she'd say. "You have such a big driveway. What's the harm?" The harm was that it was my driveway, and I was sick of coming home to find it occupied by her entitled self. I tried parking in my own driveway to block her out, but she just parked halfway on my lawn instead. The audacity was unreal. Then came the final straw. One evening, I pulled in after a long day at work only to find her SUV sitting right there as usual. Except this time, when I knocked on her door, she refused to answer. I rang the bell again. Nothing. I could see her through the window, sitting on the couch, deliberately ignoring me. I'd had enough. If Nancy wanted to play games, I was about to show her how that worked. The next weekend, I made a trip to the hardware store. I bought bricks, a lot of bricks. Over the course of a single afternoon, I built a short but sturdy brick wall right at the edge of my driveway. Not high enough to be dangerous, but just enough to make it impossible for her to pull in without running over solid stone. Then, for good measure, I grabbed a giant piece of cardboard and a thick marker. I walked right up to her SUV, taped the sign to the windshield, and stepped back to admire my work. In big, bold letters, it read, "For sale cheap. Owner refuses to move IT, call for details." I barely had time to get inside before I heard the shriek from outside. Nancy's screech echoed down the street, loud enough to make a few neighbors peek out their windows. She stormed onto my driveway, her face twisted in fury as she ripped the sign off her windshield. Her eyes darted to the brick barrier blocking her usual parking spot, and I could practically see the gears in her head grinding as she tried to process what had just happened. She turned on me like a snake, her finger jabbing the air as she stomped toward my front door. I barely had time to open it before she started yelling. "You think this is funny?" she snapped, waving the piece of cardboard in my face. "This is harassment." I crossed my arms and leaned against the door frame. "Harassment? No, Nancy. Harassment is when someone repeatedly parks in a spot that doesn't belong to them after being asked several times to stop." Her nostrils flared. "You can't just build a wall in front of your driveway. That's against HOA regulations." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh. Show me where it says I can't put decorative brickwork on my own property." She opened her mouth, then shut it again, her jaw tightening. I could tell she didn't have a real argument, just blind entitlement. She settled for crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd personally ruined her life. "This is petty," she huffed. "You could have just talked to me instead of pulling this childish stunt." I let out a laugh. "Oh, you mean like the multiple times I knocked on your door, asked you to move, and you ignored me? Or the time you just sat there pretending not to hear me?" Her face darkened, but she knew she had no defense. Instead, she pivoted to her favorite tactic, intimidation. "You realize I'm the HOA president, right?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I can have this removed, and I can fine you for violating community aesthetics. I shrugged. Go ahead. But be prepared to explain why you've been illegally using my driveway for weeks. I've got security footage of every single time you parked here without permission. And I'm pretty sure the city would be interested in you blocking private property. She blinked, caught off guard. I could see her confidence waver as she realized I wasn't bluffing. You wouldn't, she muttered. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen a few times. Actually, I was just about to send an email to the city's parking enforcement office. Want to see the footage before I do? Her expression twisted into something ugly. She clenched the piece of cardboard in her hands so tightly that it crumpled. For a second, I thought she might actually throw a tantrum right there on my doorstep. Instead, she spun around without another word, stomped to her SUV, and yanked open the door. She reversed so fast I half expected her to take out my mailbox. Then, just like that, she was gone. I expected some kind of retaliation, but for the next few days, Nancy stayed surprisingly quiet. No sudden fines appeared in my mailbox, no passive-aggressive emails about violations. For the first time in weeks, my driveway remained untouched, but I knew better than to think she was done. Nancy wasn't the type to let things go. She was just biding her time. Sure enough, on Friday morning, I stepped outside to find a bright orange notice taped to my door. A formal violation from the HOA. Unauthorized construction, it read. Failure to obtain approval for exterior alterations. I laughed under my breath. Predictable. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the notice. Then I sent a quick text to my lawyer friend Mark. Hey, I wrote. Hypothetically, if an HOA president tried to fine me for putting decorative brickwork on my own property, how illegal would that be? His response came within minutes. Depends. If it's on your property and it doesn't violate zoning laws, they don't have a leg to stand on. What's going on? I told him everything. The illegal parking, the ignored warnings, the brick wall, and now the sudden violation notice. After a brief pause, he sent another message. She's retaliating, that's illegal. You want to fight this? I grinned at my phone. Oh, absolutely. I wasn't the kind of person to roll over when someone tried to push me around, and Nancy had just made a critical mistake. She thought she could intimidate me with a bogus HOA violation, but what she didn't realize was that I was already 2 steps ahead. Before I even left for work that morning, I made a quick stop inside and grabbed a folder from my desk. Inside was every piece of documentation I had gathered over the past few weeks, photos of her SUV in my driveway, timestamps from my security cameras, even records of my previous complaints to her that she had ignored. I was prepared to fight this, and I wasn't going to do it quietly. When I got to my office, I made a phone call to the city's zoning department just to be safe. After explaining the situation to a surprisingly helpful clerk, she confirmed exactly what my friend Mark had predicted. Nancy had no authority to issue a violation for something built entirely on my own property. She even laughed a little when I described the brick wall. Sounds like she's just mad she can't park there anymore, the clerk said. That was all I needed to hear. Now, it was time to put my plan into motion. Nancy thrived on people being too afraid to challenge her, but I had no intention of playing by her rules. Instead of going to her directly, I decided to hit her where it hurt the HOA board. That evening, I attended the next homeowners meeting, armed with my evidence and a very specific goal in mind. The meeting was already underway when I arrived, and Nancy was seated at the front of the room, playing the role of the all-powerful president. She was in the middle of droning on about some new landscaping requirements when I raised my hand. I have a concern that needs to be addressed, I said, standing up. Nancy's expression tightened the moment she saw me. This isn't the time for individual complaints. It's not a complaint, I interrupted. It's a violation of my property rights by the HOA president. A murmur rippled through the room. That got people's attention. Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. If you have an issue, you need to submit it in writing. I already did, I said, holding up a copy of my emailed complaint to the board. And I have proof that the HOA president has been illegally using my driveway for weeks, ignored multiple requests to stop, and then issued a retaliatory violation when I blocked her access. The room went dead silent. Nancy's face reddened. That's not what happened, she snapped. You're twisting the situation. I pulled out the printed security footage stills and held them up. These timestamps prove otherwise. And I also spoke to the city's zoning department. They confirmed that my brick wall is completely legal and that the violation you issued is nothing more than harassment. A few board members exchanged glances. One of them, a man named Alan, cleared his throat awkwardly. Nancy, is this true? She folded her arms. He's exaggerating. I only parked there a few times. 7 times, I corrected, flipping through the photos. And if we're talking about HOA violations, I'd like to point out that the bylaws specifically prohibit board members from using their position for personal gain. Which, I'd argue, includes commandeering someone's private property. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nancy, I think we need to discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss, I said, my voice firm. She abused her position, issued a fraudulent violation, and I want it formally rescinded. Immediately, Nancy's jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might crack. She looked around the room, realizing she was losing control of the situation. Finally, with visible reluctance, she exhaled sharply. Fine, she said. Consider the violation revoked, I smiled. Put it in writing. Her eye twitched, but she had no choice. Under the scrutiny of the board and the watching homeowners, she had to comply. With that victory secured, I decided to go one step further. And considering this abuse of power, I continued, I think it's time we also discuss whether Nancy is fit to continue leading this HOA. That sent a shockwave through the room. Nancy jolted upright. You can't, actually, per HOA bylaws, I said smoothly. A board member can be removed by a vote if misconduct is proven. So, let's put it to a vote. I could see the panic in Nancy's eyes as she realized she had lost control of the narrative. The very people she had been lording her authority over were now seeing her for what she was, a power-hungry bully who thought she was above the rules. Alan hesitated, then sighed. We'll need to schedule an official vote, but if enough homeowners support it, we can move forward with a recall. I turned to the room. Who here has been unfairly fined or harassed by this HOA under Nancy's leadership? Hands shot up. More than I expected. Nancy paled. I had just cracked the dam, and now the floodgates were opening. Residents started voicing their grievances, sharing their own stories of Nancy's overreach, unfair fines, arbitrary rule changes, and blatant favoritism. She had ruled through intimidation for so long that she never expected people to push back. But now they were, and the best part? This was only the beginning. The HOA meeting had turned into a full-scale rebellion. Homeowners, once too intimidated to speak out, were now openly voicing their frustrations. One after another, they shared stories of being fined for arbitrary reasons, having their landscaping choices micromanaged, and dealing with Nancy's favoritism when it came to rule enforcement. Nancy, still seated at the front, looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Her initial outrage had given way to visible discomfort as she realized just how many people she had alienated. The board members sitting beside her exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure of whether to defend her or distance themselves from the backlash. Alan, the board member who had spoken earlier, tried to regain control of the meeting. He cleared his throat and raised his hands in an attempt to calm the room. "All right, I think we need to take the proper steps if we're going to move forward with any kind of formal action against Nancy." A man from the back scoffed. "Proper steps? She's been abusing her position for years. Why should we wait?" Another homeowner, an older woman named Linda, shook her head. "We've been patient long enough. We should have removed her a long time ago." The crowd murmured in agreement. Nancy sat up straighter, her voice cutting through the noise. "You can't just remove me because you don't like my leadership." A younger woman near the front folded her arms. "It's not about liking or disliking you. It's about how you've treated this entire community like your personal kingdom." Nancy's lips pressed together in a thin line, but before she could respond, I stepped forward. "This isn't just a matter of personal grievances. There are documented violations of HOA rules under her leadership. If we follow the bylaws, we can call for a vote to remove her. And based on what I'm seeing here, I don't think there's going to be much opposition to that." Alan sighed. "Fine, we'll organize an official recall vote. But we need signatures from at least 30% of the homeowners before we can proceed." A woman near the side of the room lifted a pen. "Then let's start right now." Nancy's eyes widened as the petition paper was passed around. People eagerly signed, some even nudging their neighbors to do the same. She tried to protest, but the momentum had shifted completely against her. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by one petty man with a grudge." That made me laugh. "Petty. You illegally used my driveway for weeks, retaliated against me when I stopped you, and now you're throwing a fit because you're finally being held accountable." Nancy's face turned a deeper shade of red, but she had no response. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The second she was gone, the tension in the air lifted. People started chatting amongst themselves, some relieved, others excited about the possibility of real change. Alan rubbed his temples. "Well, I guess we'll be organizing a recall vote sooner than expected." Linda smiled. "Good. It's about time we take back control of this HOA." With the meeting wrapped up, I left knowing that Nancy's days as president were numbered, but I also knew she wasn't going to go down quietly. She had spent too long ruling with an iron fist to simply accept defeat. Sure enough, it didn't take long for her next move. The following morning, I stepped outside to find a tow truck idling in front of my house. A man in a reflective vest was standing beside my car, clipboard in hand. I approached with a frown. "What's going on?" The man glanced up. "Got a report that this vehicle is illegally parked." I let out a sharp laugh. "Illegally parked? On my own property?" He furrowed his brow and checked the clipboard. "Your HOA president reported it as an unauthorized vehicle obstructing a community pathway." I shook my head. "That's a blatant lie. This is my driveway." The man sighed. "Look, I don't want trouble, but if I get a call to tow, I have to follow procedure." I pulled out my phone. "Give me a second." I scrolled through my messages and quickly found Alan's contact. After a brief call explaining the situation, Alan assured me that no such order had been approved by the board. "This is just Nancy trying to flex power she doesn't have anymore," he said. "I'll handle it." Minutes later, Alan arrived in person and spoke with the tow truck driver, confirming that the HOA had no official authority to tow vehicles without proper cause. The driver, clearly not interested in getting involved in a dispute, promptly left. Alan turned to me with a grim expression. "She's panicking. She knows she's on her way out, so she's grasping at straws." I nodded. "Which means she's not done yet," and I was right. Over the next few days, Nancy made increasingly desperate attempts to hold onto control. She started issuing sudden fines to multiple homeowners, all of which were baseless. She tried to implement new, restrictive rules overnight, claiming they were for the betterment of the community. But by this point, no one was listening. People ignored the fines. They pushed back on the new rules, and most importantly, they continued signing the petition for her removal. By the end of the week, we had more than enough signatures. The recall vote was scheduled for the following Saturday. Word spread quickly, and nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. Nancy, clearly rattled, tried to argue her case, but her words fell on deaf ears. When the votes were counted, the result was undeniable. She had lost. Nancy was officially removed as HOA president. The moment it was announced, a wave of relief swept through the room. People clapped, some even cheering. Nancy, on the other hand, looked like she was barely holding it together. She stood stiffly, her hands clenched at her sides. Then, without a word, she turned and left. That was the last time she ever attended an HOA meeting. With Nancy gone, the board quickly moved to undo her worst policies. The arbitrary fines were revoked, the ridiculous rules were rolled back, and for the first time in a long while, homeowners actually had a say in how their community was run. As for me, I enjoyed my driveway, completely free of unwanted subs. With Nancy out as HOA president, the neighborhood began to breathe again. The oppressive atmosphere that had once loomed over the community started to lift, and people no longer walked on eggshells, fearing arbitrary fines or sudden rule changes. The recall vote had not only removed her from power, but had also sent a clear message her reign of control was over. That being said, Nancy wasn't the type to go quietly. For the first few days after her removal, she kept a low profile. No one saw much of her, aside from the occasional glimpse of her peeking out her window like a bitter queen in exile. But then, just as I began thinking she might actually accept her defeat, she made her next move. It started with strange letters appearing in people's mailboxes. Unofficial documents printed on plain paper, filled with long-winded complaints about how the neighborhood was falling into chaos without her leadership. She framed herself as the victim, claiming that she had been unjustly ousted by a mob that didn't understand the responsibilities of maintaining a prestigious community. Most people tossed the letters straight into the trash. A few had a good laugh over them, but I knew better than to assume this was all she had planned. A few days later, I caught her outside, talking to a small group of homeowners near the community entrance. She was animated, gesturing wildly, her voice carrying just enough for me to pick up snippets of her rant. She was trying to rally support, claiming that the HOA board was now incompetent without her and that a leadership crisis was brewing. The problem was, no one was buying it. The people she was talking to nodded politely, but their expressions were skeptical. No one was eager to put her back in power. And after a few minutes, they made excuses and walked away, leaving her standing there seething. That was when she turned her attention back to me. One evening, I pulled into my driveway to find her standing at the edge of her property, arms crossed. She watched me as I stepped out of my car, her gaze sharp with unspoken irritation. I didn't acknowledge her. If she wanted something, she could say it. She did. "You think you've won," she said, her tone tight. "But you have no idea what you've done to this community." I leaned against my car, unbothered. "The community seems fine. Actually, people seem happier now." Her lips pressed together. "You don't understand how much work goes into maintaining order. Without structure, things will fall apart." I met her stare evenly. "You mean without you controlling everything?" "Because so far, I haven't seen any chaos, just people enjoying their homes without unnecessary interference." Her fingers clenched around her sleeves. "You don't realize the damage you've caused." I tilted my head slightly. "You mean the damage you caused to yourself. Because as far as I can tell, you did this to yourself." A flicker of something passed over her expression: anger, frustration, maybe even regret, but she swallowed it down. Instead, she straightened her posture, attempting to regain some sense of authority. "You'll see," she muttered. "This neighborhood can't function without strong leadership." I watched as she turned sharply and walked back into her house, slamming the door behind her. It was clear that Nancy wasn't giving up, but her influence had been shattered. No one was listening to her anymore. And then, just when I thought she might finally accept reality, she escalated again. 2 days later, a city inspector showed up at my door. He was polite but firm, explaining that he had received an anonymous complaint about my brick wall, claiming it was a safety hazard. I knew exactly who had filed that complaint. I invited the inspector to take a closer look, confident that everything was within legal bounds. He examined the structure, checked the measurements, and eventually nodded in approval. "There's nothing wrong here," he admitted. "Whoever reported this was reaching." I sighed, shaking my head. "I have a pretty good idea who it was." He gave me a knowing look. "We get these kinds of complaints all the time. People trying to use city services to settle personal disputes. It's a waste of time." I thanked him for his professionalism and he left without issue. Nancy had failed again. By this point, her desperation was obvious. Every attempt she made to regain control backfired. The community ignored her, the HOA board refused to entertain her complaints, and now the city had dismissed her false report. But she still wasn't done. A week later, she launched her final and most ridiculous attempt to reclaim authority. She tried to form a private neighborhood council. She printed out flyers and went door to door, claiming that the HOA had been compromised and that the neighborhood needed an alternative governing body to restore order. People humored her at first, but as soon as they realized she was just trying to create a fake HOA where she was still in charge, they shut her down. Some even started posting the flyers online, mocking her efforts. Her reputation, already in shambles, crumbled completely. And then, finally, she gave up. One morning, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of her house. Nancy was leaving. It didn't take long for the news to spread, and by the end of the day, people were openly celebrating. A few neighbors even joked about throwing a block party in honor of her departure. She must have sensed the lack of sympathy, because she left quietly, avoiding contact with everyone. By nightfall, her house was empty, and just like that, she was gone. The neighborhood moved on quickly. Without her, things actually improved. The HOA, now under new leadership, became more reasonable. People no longer feared sudden fines or arbitrary rule changes. As for me, I enjoyed my driveway, free of unwanted vehicles. And every time I looked at that brick wall, I smiled. Because it wasn't just a barrier, it was a reminder that standing up to bullies was always worth it. With Nancy gone, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The oppressive, anxiety-inducing atmosphere she had cultivated for years slowly dissipated. People no longer hesitated to decorate their homes the way they liked or worried about sudden fines appearing in their mailboxes. I was finally able to enjoy my property without the looming threat of someone trying to claim my driveway as their personal parking space. The brick wall remained, not just as a functional boundary, but as a symbol of the victory over Nancy's tyranny. For a while, I expected some lingering consequences from her departure, maybe legal threats, or a sudden, last-ditch effort to reclaim her position through technicalities. But the truth was, Nancy had burned every bridge she had. She had spent years ruling through intimidation, and the moment her power was stripped away, she had no allies left to defend her. The new HOA board, now led by a reasonable and level-headed president named Claire, worked quickly to undo the damage Nancy had inflicted. Arbitrary rules were repealed, excessive fines were reviewed and revoked, and there was even talk of rewriting the bylaws to prevent another power-hungry individual from taking control in the future. One evening, as I was bringing my trash bins to the curb, Claire approached with a clipboard in hand. She was a middle-aged woman with an air of quiet confidence, the complete opposite of Nancy's overbearing presence. She wasted no time getting to the point. The board was drafting new regulations, ones that would prevent any single individual from having unchecked control over the community. They wanted to ensure that no future HOA president could abuse their position the way Nancy had, and they were seeking input from homeowners. It was a refreshing change, being asked for input rather than being dictated to. I gladly signed my name in support of the revisions, and from that point on, the HOA actually started functioning as it was meant to, serving the community rather than controlling it. But just when I thought I had seen the last of Nancy's impact, a new problem emerged. One morning, I noticed a car idling near the entrance of the neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for people to park temporarily, but this vehicle lingered for far too long. Over the next few days, different cars would park in the same spot, sometimes with people sitting inside, sometimes empty. At first, I dismissed it as a coincidence. Maybe visitors were just waiting to pick someone up. But then I started noticing a pattern. It was always a different car, but the same behavior. They never approached anyone, never got out. Just sat there watching. Something wasn't right. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few neighbors mentioned seeing the same thing, and soon, speculation began to spread. Some thought it might be a private investigator. Others joked that Nancy had hired someone to spy on the neighborhood out of spite. The more I observed, the more I realized it wasn't a joke. One afternoon, as I was trimming my front lawn, I caught a glimpse of movement near my driveway. A man in an unmarked uniform was standing by my brick wall, taking photos. I walked over, keeping my voice calm but firm as I addressed him. He hesitated before replying, claiming to be a city inspector following up on an anonymous complaint. That was all I needed to hear. I knew exactly who was behind this. Nancy might have left, but she clearly wasn't done trying to make my life difficult. I asked the man for his credentials, and to his credit, he provided them without hesitation. After verifying his identity, I pressed him for details. He admitted that multiple complaints had been filed regarding unauthorized structures in the neighborhood, specifically targeting my brick wall. But just like before, there was no actual violation. The city had already reviewed the wall once and deemed it legal. There was no legitimate reason for another inspection. I thanked him for his time and watched as he left, shaking his head as if he had been expecting this to be a waste of time. That night, I did some digging. A quick online search led me to a local private investigator's office, one that specialized in neighborhood disputes. It didn't take much effort to confirm that Nancy had indeed hired someone to monitor the community. The sheer pettiness of it all was almost impressive. Rather than confronting her directly, I decided to use her own tactics against her. I reached out to a few trusted neighbors and asked if they had received any unusual inquiries about their properties. As expected, a handful of them had been contacted by someone claiming to be from the city, asking about disruptions in the community. Armed with this information, I filed a formal complaint with the local authorities regarding harassment and frivolous reports. I also contacted the private investigator's office directly and informed them that their client was engaging in retaliatory behavior. It didn't take long for the situation to unravel. Within a week, the investigator cut ties with Nancy, refusing to take any further cases from her. The city, tired of the repeated false complaints, issued a warning that any further baseless reports could result in legal consequences for wasting municipal resources. And just like that, Nancy's last attempt at control fizzled out. The cars stopped appearing. The anonymous complaints ceased. She had officially lost for good. With Nancy finally out of the picture, the neighborhood flourished. People no longer feared stepping out of line, and the community grew closer as a result. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my home in peace. No more unauthorized parking, no more surprise fines, no more HOA tyranny, just quiet, well-earned freedom.